So in the past, I've made a few chainswords. I made a small chainsword. I've made a big chainsword. But this is a very detailed chainsword. This is the Tigrus Mark 15 Heavy Eviscerator from Darktide, and it is an insanely cool sword. So, let me show you how I made it. I first started by getting measurements on the chainsword. I loaded up Darktide and got some images of our in-game character carrying the sword. I measured the character and sword on screen, and then did some quick math and converted the character's height to my girlfriend's height, since this sword will be for her. And with that figured out, I applied the same math to the chainsword on screen to get the measurements of how big I want the sword to be, which is about 38 inches. And with that all figured out, I took a few screenshots of the sword and the weapon viewer, and then I hopped over to my very old copy of Adobe Flash, switched my rulers to inches, and began tracing to make my template. Just like my last two weapons in this project, this template comes in layers and is free on my website, linked in the description. One thing to note, however, when printing an Acrobat, for some reason I had to scale this down to 80% for it to be accurate. But the final size is really up to you, so make it as big as you want. I started with the core structure. This will be where the PVC pipe handle will be joined, and where the chain blade will be attached. This core was 3 layers of foam, 5mm in the center, and 2 10mm pieces on the side. This helps keep the sword thin, as it should be, and the seams of the foam will act as a guide later for when I glue the chain blades, allowing an even gap on the left and right side. I then cut out a channel for the PVC pipe handle and glued that in place. I also traced and cut out all the blades for the chain blade, twice. My original thought was that 2 10mm pieces glued together would work fine. Spoilers though, these got taken out and replaced later. And before moving forward, I noticed that the tip of the core was still a little bit wobbly, so I added some large dowels at the end to kind of help hold it still. Alright, so before I start doing anything else, the next thing I want to do is start dremeling everything smooth. So right now, this is more or less just the internal structure. This is pretty much what the links of chain are going to attach to, but obviously I need to dremel it. I'm not rich, don't have a big fancy craft place, so I don't have like a fancy giant Dremel booth, but what I do have, which I have shown before, is this homemade thing made of insulation foam. I just place it down like this. Now, your rotary tool or whatever you're using, it's only going to spin in one direction, so I'm holding it towards like this, you know, with my right hand, it's going to throw all that dust towards me. More or less, that's what this is for. This is more or less just a shield. I hold everything down here, it's going to hit on this side here, and it's all just going to collect right here. Is it perfect? No. Is it better than nothing? By a long shot. Makes cleanup a lot easier. There's very minimal overspray, I guess you could say. Makes the process a lot easier. I think I only use like 2 sheets of these squares. You can buy them at Home Depot. The base is 1 square, and the other one I just kind of cut up. Made these 2 sides low so I can fit my arms in there to hold everything. And then this little window here so I can see. Then I just make sure I just try and do it all right up against this tall side. All collects there. Less of a mess. Less time you gotta spend cleaning, more time you can spend crafting. For the core, I only really needed to sand smooth the portion where the chain blades will be glued. This will ensure that the blades have an even flat spot to attach to. And with that done came the long tedious task of cleaning up every blade, evening out the bottoms for better glue contact, rounding the edges, and sharpening the tips, you name it. I applied contact cement to the bottom of the blades, and then glued them to the edge of the core. I then started working on the innermost shape of the chainsword. This would be the portion here under the armor plating. And with that shape cut out, I glued it to the sides of the core structure with just a little bit of overhang on the blade side so that the blades will appear slightly recessed. And because the back side of this has a beveled edge, I traced out the bevel from the template and cut that portion out, which I should have done before gluing. I used a piece of 10mm foam and cut it to shape, with a 45-degree cut on both sides to fill in that back side. This portion will never be seen, but it will act like a support structure for the armor plating and details later. And with those sides on, I was not liking the chains at all. For starters, they were too thick in comparison to the in-game sword, plus they weren't evenly placed. And I didn't have enough room for additional details at the base of the chain, which I should have done prior to putting those chains on. So, I removed them all by hand and started over. This time, I used 10mm and 5mm laminated. I went through the same exact process again. But instead of just putting them back by hand, this time I measured out the space I had and made up a strip of 2mm foam to attach the blades to first. This way I knew that my blades were all evenly placed. And once they were all on the strip, I also cut out and glued little bits at the base of the blades to make it look more mechanical. And with the whole chain belt assembled, I glued it back into the sword. The outer plating is split into 3 pieces on each side. I traced them out, including the markings needed for all the angle cuts along the blade side. I then proceeded to cut them out, including the opening notches along the angle's edge. Before I glued them onto the sword, I took my Dremel and cleaned everything up, and rounded the edges. That way the seams between the plates will be a lot more prominent. And with everything glued on, I had to do the same thing to the back side of the chainsword, making everything in 3 pieces, and those 3 pieces also being comprised of 3 more pieces. With those all glued on, I moved on to making the base of the sword. This was several layers of foam of various cut sizes to come up to this very complex shape. After that was the handguard. This was several layers as well, with popsicle sticks inside for stiffness, and a metal L bracket in the corner to keep it from bending. I left a portion of the L bracket exposed. That way when I go to glue it onto the base of the sword, it'll stick into the sword for extra support. From here I started working on the handle, making the trim around the base of the sword, and the trim for the end. At this time, I realized that I cut the handle too short and needed to add a few inches. So I found a wooden dowel that just barely fit inside the PVC pipe and made a wrap around it that was exactly as thick as the pipe, so that the attachment would be flush with the pipe. I then dremeled any bumps smooth and started working on the wrap for the handle, so that things would be seamless. And with the handle wrap done, I began working on the tip of the handle. This gear-like object has several sprocket teeth around the sides, which means cutting out and sanding tons of tiny little triangles. I also gave the cap a recessed section where it will be glued. This way it has more to grab onto and is less likely to pull off after gluing. And while I waited for that glue to dry, I cleaned up my handle wrap by adding tiny trim to the top and bottom to hide any uneven seams. And with the glue finally dry, I pressed the handle cap onto the end of the handle. Up next was all the decorations on the chainsword. I started out by cutting all my template's detail pieces and started making the tiny exhaust vent on the side. Because the side is 2 layers of foam laminated together, I just cut out the top layer and made a vent grating to go back inside, using a thinner piece of foam. Then I cut out and traced the Imperium logo onto a piece of foam, deliberately cut to the shape of the center plate on the sword. The plan was to cut the bird out, but still have it stay in the foam sheet. This way I can glue the entire sheet to the center plating, and then remove everything but the bird, so that every piece of the bird was exactly where it needed to be. Picking out all the excess from in between the feathers and toes was a little bit of a struggle, but I managed to get it done, and the end result looked really good. Up next, I started working on the piece at the tip of the chainsword. This was 5 pieces total, 1 for each side, and 3 for the back. This was tricky to do for some reason, and I kid you not, it took me like 4 or 5 tries to get this right. After like my 4th attempt, I called it a day and went to bed, and when I got up, I got it perfect on the first try. What a waste of foam. Long story short, don't ever craft when you're tired. And last but not least, was the motor and exhaust vents at the bottom of the chainsword. These were also just as complicated as the cover on the top, even more so due to it being multiple layers. Both layers were carved out of 10mm foam, angle and straight cuts being done where needed. And after gluing them onto the side, I got to deal with all the fun of getting that bevel wrap around the backside. This took a lot of trial and error as well, soon realizing that I would need to fit a small portion of foam underneath, gluing down a support layer, and then the outer layer on top. And with the exhaust vent portion cut open, I needed to fill that section to cover up all that support material. I used a piece of 5mm foam and figured out its shape. Then using the tip of my Dremel, I made several circle markings in this piece, similar to what's in the in-game model. And with that all done, I glued its backside and pressed it into place. And from there, I was going to need to give that exhaust a shield. I used my template to figure out where those pieces should go, and then carved out several square dowels from 10mm foam, giving them angle cuts where needed to get the desired bends to fit snug over the exhaust. And with a little bit of contact cement, pressed them all into place. Up next was a cylinder that runs all along the back. I made this by literally cutting out a crap ton of circles and gluing them together. And while doing this, I also made other small details, like a little circle button for one of the sides. And while I waited for all the glue to dry, I took that time and used my Dremel again to dig out all the rivets and bolt holes in the chainsword. And with the glue now dry, I started pressing layers together and started carving out a channel for them to rest in. At first, I was just going to carve out from the sides and lay a piece on top along the back side. But I figured for it to be believable, and for the cylinder to appear consistent from end to end, I needed to be one solid piece, going the whole way through. So I cut a channel the entire way through the back side and glued everything into place. And there we have it, finished chainsword from Darktide. This is one of the cooler looking chainswords in the game. I love the details on it for sure. Maybe once these cosplays are done, I might jump into just making more weapons from this game, because a lot of the weapons in this game are just so cool to look at. This makes my third weapon now. Technically, I think I built this one first out of the three. I didn't go into detail in the video, but I actually tried to make this functional at first. Well, didn't try to. The original planning was to make it functional. I had done all the R&D work and all that stuff, but I realized that there were a couple setups that I ran into. One being time. I mean, time was the biggest factor. 2 costumes, 3 weapons. It was going to take a while, and just making this thing stationary was going to cut off at least 2 weeks. And that was time I didn't want to waste. I'll probably try to do it again at another time when I don't have a deadline. There were several issues I ran into. I mean, obviously, trying to keep it this thin while still functional was an issue. Not just keep it thin, but also keeping it structurally tough. Because, I mean, there was insanely little amount of room for it, because the chain wrapped around ending here and up here. So that meant all of that had to be hollow, but also had to fit a motor in there somewhere. And then a trigger for it as well. I had bought like a kid's chainsaw toy, like the one that would actually work with the trigger to make the little rubber chain work. I was going to gut that, do everything like that, hook it all up, and I had plans drawn out for it and everything, but it wasn't going to work with keeping this thin. I probably could have found a way, but it would have been tough. I was like, let's set that aside and I'll do it another day. And I'm glad I did, because I'm very nitpicky when it comes to like trying to get things as accurate as I can. And I think I did pretty good with this. Just like the last 2 weapons in those videos, this is obviously still in an unfinished state. It's not painted, it's not primed, nor is it sealed. It's starting to warm up a little bit more. I'm still going to wait probably another 2 weeks before I actually take everything out and paint it. A lot of my armor on my costume is also done. I am falling very behind on my videos. So we'll just wrap this up with some glamour shots. And I'm going to get out of here and get back to work. I do like this little thingy on the end though. Looks like it could also be a weapon in and of itself, you know? It's like when that's not enough. And it's like, finish the job and smash him in the face. Pretty cool.